Hello and welcome. Bienvenidos y bienvenidos to everybody. Thank you for inviting me today to give a brief talk about reconciliation in the Diocese of British Columbia in Canada. It might seem a bit strange that an Anglican priest from Germany, who is currently living in Switzerland, gives a talk on Indigenous reconciliation in Canada. So let me briefly explain how I got to study this topic. In 2021, I received funding for a 6-month research project on reconciliation at the University of Victoria, British Columbia. In my own academic research, I focus on the connection between Christian spirituality and political activism. The fellowship in Victoria allowed me to learn about a field that is outside of my own academic comfort zone. And I was curious to learn more about the reconciliation work in British Columbia and understand the parallels and differences to social justice processes in Europe. I don't know about your contexts. Maybe some of you have Indigenous roots. Maybe some of you work closely with Indigenous groups in your countries. And maybe some of you have researched reconciliation in your own context for a long time. In this talk, I hope to give an introduction to the situation in Canada, and most of all, to give impulses for discussion and for a space for sharing your own experiences. So this talk has 3 parts. First, I will give a brief introduction to the reconciliation work in the Diocese of British Columbia. Then I will share some thoughts on the role that theology can play for reconciliation. And finally, I would like to give some questions and impulses for the following discussion. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about reconciliation? Reconciliation is a complex and multi-layered concept. As a political process, it emerged first in societies transitioning from times of authoritarian rules or civil war. Since then, it has been applied to societies still struggling with the historical wrongs of settler colonialism. However, there remains a significant lack of agreement about the meaning of the word reconciliation. Much research has attempted to define the concept further and to boil it down to an agreed policy framework. Within the Canadian context, scholars have questioned whether reconciliation is even a suitable goal for future relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Some scholars even argue that it is impossible for settlers to be allies and to take Indigenous claims and experiences seriously while they still remain on occupied land. In addition to practical and political dimensions, as theologians, we have to grapple with the spiritual layers of the process. So let's have a closer look at the reconciliation work in British Columbia. British Columbia is a province on the west coast of Canada, and the Anglican Diocese of British Columbia is more or less identical with Vancouver Island, that island at the very southwest of Canada. Here, slightly bigger on the map. The Diocese of British Columbia on Vancouver Island is located on the traditional unceded land of the Coast Salish, the Nuu-chah-nulth and Kwakwaka'wakw peoples. During the times of colonialism in Canada, the Church was compliant with imperialist and supremacist ideals. In Canada, one of the most significant manifestations of colonialist oppression were the so-called residential schools, a network of boarding schools for Indigenous peoples. The school system was created to isolate Indigenous people and Indigenous children from the influence of their own cultures and religion in order to assimilate them into the dominant Canadian culture. On the picture on the slides, you can see a depiction of the moment when Indigenous people were taken away from their parents and how priests were involved in that process. In these schools, children experienced various forms of abuse, and many died or disappeared during the time there. Only in the late 1980s, the Anglican Church of Canada started a process of reconciliation with Indigenous groups and began to take responsibility for the injustice, violence, and oppression it had been involved since the first missionaries entered the land. On its website, the Diocese of British Columbia emphasizes the importance of reconciliation work for its ministry today. It describes reconciliation as an ongoing process deeply related to our own baptismal covenant and the unique role the Church played in the history of colonialization in our country, including the residential schools. The Church describes this process of reconciliation as a journey of listening, truth-telling, repentance, and healing with Indigenous people, both those within and those outside of the Church. Practical examples of this process are the financial support of local reconciliation projects, the organizing of workshops on reconciliation across the diocese, the establishment of an Indigenous Elders Council, and programs for deepening knowledge about intersectionality and racism. A particularly notable example of the diocese's work is Bishop Logan's so-called Sacred Journey in 2016. In March 2016, during the liturgical season of Lent, Bishop Logan walked 480 kilometers. It is about 300 miles across the diocese. On his journey, he sought permission from First Nation representatives to enter and stay on their traditional lands. Many First Nation leaders welcomed the bishop. However, some denied him entry. The bishop's walk manifested the image of reconciliation as an ongoing journey. The journey was part of the diocese acknowledgement as the Anglican Church that they entered these lands as colonialists, asserting their right to ownership of the land and dominion over its Indigenous peoples. So being an academic visitor in a context that's not your own has both advantages and disadvantages. In the best case, it allows for a fresh and creative approach to a situation. At the same time, the lack of depth and historically grown connection can make a researcher detached and naive towards certain contexts. During my stay in Victoria, I found that theology can best support reconciliation work when, first, it is aware of its own perspective and limitations, and second, it facilitates authentic dialogue and creative questions. First, I realized during my stay how crucial a reflection on my own perspective was for an authentic approach to theology. To reflect on my own position in the discourse I had to grow in awareness of my role in ongoing oppression and colonialism. For me, writing as an Anglican minister about a church historically involved in cultural genocide, a church that continues to be entangled in ongoing structural colonialism, this meant that I had to carefully discern the limits and intentions of my own work. By taking my own standpoint as a white settler and visitor seriously, I needed to admit that I did not have an objective view of the discourse and the implications my research might have. As a result, I had to admit that I could not know whether my research would be at all useful and contribute to the work of reconciliation on any level. And that the only thing that I was able to do was to try and cultivate attentiveness and the willingness to learn. Secondly, even when theology is not immediately concerned with questions of indigeneity and reconciliation, it always happens within a certain social and cultural context. Theology always has social implications. As theologians, we need to ask ourselves how we can ask critical and open-ended questions about the role that church plays within society. Theology can also enable Christians involved in social justice work to think about their own experiences and agency from a faith perspective. I believe that theology can be critical in revealing and reflecting on historical and present wrongs, but also on possible paths forwards towards reconciliation and a deepening of faith and growing in our identity as Christians. So finally, before moving to the breakout rooms, I would like to end with some questions and some concluding remarks. I suggest that theology as a practice of reflecting on our perspective as Christians, articulating questions, and listening to marginalized voices can be a starting point for renewed understanding of reconciliation within the church. I think that it can help the church to turn anew towards God's love for all people and to ask for forgiveness for the wrongs it has done in the past. It can also help us understand the limits of human work and the importance of hope and faith in God's grace and forgiveness. So I wonder where this presentation and this brief summary of my work in Canada leaves you. Maybe it has given you some impulses about what questions to ask next and gained a new perspective on what you already knew about reconciliation. Maybe you feel that this approach does not fit your own context or your understanding of theology. What do you think? What can the church learn about itself through a deeper understanding of reconciliation? How can it deepen its understanding of individual and collective faith and trust in God? I'm curious to hear about your own perspectives and experiences. Is the church in your area involved in any kind of reconciliation work? Are Indigenous people part of the church? Are their experiences and perspectives taken seriously? What are the similarities and differences to the process in British Columbia and in your own countries? I'm looking forward to discussion, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.